right, let's sit nice and tall and close the eyes. Allow yourself to land softly in this moment. Allow your heart to beat with peaceful enthusiasm, gentle curiosity, and with sweet purpose. See that every beat of your heart and every breath that you take, every thought that you have, is filled with the intention to know Source, to know divinity. See everything you do, you think, or you intend as an offering. An offering to that knowing, to that relationship. See your life's purpose as that. Draw the hands together at the heart. And we'll lift our voices in one Om, breathing in. And I'll share 2 mantra with you. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvina Varhitamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Asatoma Satgamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Bowing the head to the heart, acknowledging all that is. And then draw the face to center and release the hands and welcome. Good to see you all today. So today we're talking about devotion, what we call in yoga Ishvara Pranidhana. We've been going through the yamas and the niyamas, and this is the 10th one. This is the 10th virtue that every spiritual seeker, every yogi cultivates in their being, in their heart, in the essence of themselves. They cultivate devotion. And maybe more than cultivate devotion is that they peel back the layers of complication that conceal the natural devotion that arises from within. So devotion is not something that you have to try. If you try to be devoted, it probably won't work. For a little while maybe. But eventually something else will be more interesting. So don't try to be devoted. Stop the trying. Surrender to devotion. By surrendering to devotion, we acknowledge that the state of devotion is a natural state of love that arises from within our very own self. It's not something that we have to try to find. Often we walk through the world and we say, well, the world's circumstances, they've stolen my devotion from me. That's not possible. They can't steal something from you that is inherently part of you, that is part of the essence of who you are. What happens instead is that life occurs. We become injured. We become sorrowful. And we say, I can't be devotional. I won't, because I'm afraid of being hurt more. And for some interesting reason, in today's world and society, we equate being devoted with something that has a weakness to it or a vulnerability to it, a vulnerability to the outside world. And so oftentimes we choose rough and tough instead of devotion. We think the rougher I am, the tougher I am, the more stubborn like a mountain, the less I'll be hurt in this life. But the reality is that if we steal from ourselves the opportunity in every moment to know this life as an offering in and of itself and as a method and a means for connection, then we are in fact hurting ourselves over and over and over again, because we are stealing from ourselves an opportunity to come into close connection with our purpose, with our dharma. Does that make sense? Yeah. So today we'll talk about devotion. We'll talk about Ishvara Pranidhana, the 5th of the niyamas, but the 10th of the virtues. And so Ishvara. Ishvara is the name of God. Ishvara is one of the many names of God. God's got a lot of names. So I have a friend who is of a different mindset than I am. And they said, how can you even begin to say that it's okay to call God this, and it's okay to call God that, and it's okay to say Christ and to also say Buddha or Shiva or Durga, that it's okay to say God is male, God is female, God is neither, and God is both. How can you even begin to explain that? And I said, actually, it's very simple. It's very simple. Hey, do you believe God is all-powerful? And she said, of course, God is all-powerful. I said, okay, God is all-powerful. Therefore, God can be whatever God wants to be. And me in my little humanness am not going to pigeonhole God into a corner and say, you can only be that one thing. No. The moment that I say that, I take away God's all-powerfulness. And I create a limitation on that, similar to the limitation that every human being has, or thinks they have. And I can't do that. In the truth of my heart, I can't do that. I can't look and say, God is only this. God can be whatever God wants to be, because that's what perfect is. What perfection spiritually is the ability of consciousness to ebb and to flow like the waves in the ocean, to show up in whatever way. And every single tradition in the world says to some degree in various words, and he comes when he's needed, or God comes when God's needed. God appears when God's needed. When humans have overrun the world with chaos, God shows up, some way, shape, or form. Whether through miracles, or through manifestation, or through incarnation, God shows up. So, who are we to say? Who are we to say? And the more that we get caught up in kind of trying to define God as a particular thing, the more we objectify God. And the more we objectify God, the less we can love God. Truly. We think, no, if I understand God, I'll love God. No, because the more we objectify something, the less we actually understand it. The more we objectify it, the more we're trying to stick it into a box, a category, and make it fit there. The less we're allowing it to be what it is. The freedom of being exactly what it is at the essence of that. When we allow the freedom is when the love comes. But when we try to define the thing, right, then if I try to define it, you can come along and tell me I'm wrong. And you just devalued what I defined. So now I've got to look at it and say, so you're telling me that this isn't an iPhone? Well, it's an iPhone. Well, if it's not an iPhone, then I've been ripped off. If it's not an iPhone, then how do I know that it's going to work properly? If it's not what I expected it to be, and you're telling me it's not what I expected it to be, so how can we cultivate love in that kind of an atmosphere? We can't. It's not possible. We can cultivate some kind of an affection, some kind of a want to love, of a desire to love. But love does not come from desire. Love comes from acceptance. Love comes from freedom. Love comes from the inner self. It doesn't come from having to rely upon other people to tell you. But we do anyway. We rely. We look for reassurance, or we look for redirection. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just understand that at some point in time, as it says in one of the scriptures, I'm not thinking which one right now, it says, there comes a time to put away childish things, childish questioning, and simply accept. Simply accept. So, to define God, and in many of the traditions associated with yoga, they say too, and in many other traditions around the world, stop trying to define that and instead just come to know that, to experience that. And how do we come to experience God? And by God, again, I don't mean male or female, masculine or feminine. It's the term that we use, To come to know that is to recognize its presence. Where is it present? Do I have to go to church? Do I have to go to temple? Do I got to come to the ashram? No, it's everywhere. It's everywhere and in all things, without exception. So when I can live in such a way that sees God everywhere, or that at least begins to, and says, so how do I see God in that bee that wants to sting me? How do I see God in that person who took my parking spot? How do I see, initially it's an inquiry. It's like, how do I see that? Why do I see them separately? Why do I see the bee separate from God, or the person separate from God, or the tree separate from God? And then we try to see God in the thing. But that trying, again, is a little bit of a difficulty, right? Because we say, I'm going to try to see God in the bee. I'm going to try. But that bee stings you, and you're like, that ain't God. God wouldn't sting me, right? So the more we try, kind of the more constricted we become. So at some point, the trying has to go to just having faith. I have faith that God is in the bee. I have faith that God is in the person. I have faith that God is in the sky, the sun, the moon, the stars, that God is everywhere and in all things without exception. I have faith. And again, that's a process, right? How do we cultivate that faith? Some people say you have to fake it till you make it. That's fine. But it's more along the lines of, in yoga, inquiry. We can look at the bee and we can say to ourselves, okay, what is a bee? Well, it's this little yellow and black thing with wings that buzzes and scares the bejesus out of people because they're afraid to get stung. Okay, I guess that's one definition. What's another? It's a collector of honey and other sweets. Oh, okay, that's another. What's another? And keep defining the thing. What is a bee? A bee is a collection of cells that have formed in a certain way. Okay, fine. Go beyond that. What is a bee? Well, it's a collection of molecules that made cells, that made tissues, that lead to this little thing that scares the bejesus out of people. Okay, fine. Keep going beyond that now. Beyond that. It's a bunch of particles that created a bunch of molecules, that created a bunch of cells. Fine, go beyond that. What is the bee? The bee is consciousness. The bee is at the very essence of the thing, that which relies upon nothing else to exist. At the very core of its being, it's consciousness. But the more that we get closer to that little thing that scares the bejesus out of people, the more that definition relies on something else. So let me say this. The little bug that scares the bejesus out of you depends upon something else in order to be that. It depends upon its appearance. It depends upon its buzzing. It depends upon its ability to fly and to fly at you and to land on you. It depends on other things. It depends on the tissues of its body, which depend on the cells, which depend on the molecules, which depend on the particles. And you can keep going, science will, until it can't go any further. And when it can't go any further, at the very core of its essence, what is it? Consciousness. It's God. It's that which relies upon nothing else to exist. so I can love that little bee. Because I know that once I strip away all these definitions and categories and things, I know that at the core essence of it, it's consciousness. Does that make sense? If we can look at more things that way, if we can inquire, we can say, well, what is this? How do I define this? And what is that definition based on? And what is that based on? We break it down, break it down, break it down. And you can't just skip to the end and say, well, everything is consciousness. We need to break it down so that we can summarily break down the way we see the world, the definitions that keep us stuck in our hatred, stuck in our preferences, stuck in our devaluation of others and the experiences of others. We need to break it down. We need to have an inquiry. But eventually that inquiry leads us to the true understanding that that's consciousness, rising up in a wave. And the wave is not different from the ocean. The wave will eventually go back to being the rest of the ocean, to not being a singular expression, because all things that come from the ocean return to the ocean. Does that make sense? Yeah. So devotion is the path of offering. It is the path of loving. It is the willingness to inquire about our relationship to each other, our relationship to the world, our relationship to the greater universe, our relationship to our narratives, our relationship to our expectations and attachments. Devotion is a willingness to undergo these inquiries not for the sake of knowing this world, but for the purpose of knowing God, of knowing the goddess, of recognizing the sacred, of recognizing what's divine. That's where the inquiry brings us to. We don't do the inquiry in yoga so that we can become yoga teachers. I mean, maybe we do, right? But what's the greater inquiry of yoga if you go into a yoga teacher training is to become... So let me say this differently. So many times yoga teacher trainings are marketed such that join us and become a yoga teacher. Undergo this inquiry so that you can teach yoga. And initially we think, yeah, that's a great career. I think I'll do that. That's such a wonderful path in life. But the reality is that's not exactly why you're going into a yoga teacher training. You're going into a yoga teacher training so that you can learn about the inquiry, so that you can learn about the path, so that you can learn how to apply yourself to those things. And then the teaching is kind of secondary. The teaching is the consequence of that. It's like, if you turn on a light bulb, it's going to shine for all to see. When you go into a teacher training, or when you go into a deep training of any kind for your chosen path, you become like that light bulb and you shine for all others to see. So the teaching is inherent there. It's a consequence of that inquiry, whether you know you're doing it or not. So the devotion is an immense act of love. And it is an act of love that, because we're human, begins with inquiry. It begins with asking about our preferences and our defining narratives. And then the willingness to break those narratives down to the common point that they all have. That is, narratives are generally false. And that once we move past the falseness of the narrative, then we can discover or rediscover the truth. And the truth is that all things are, in essence, the flow of consciousness, manifesting itself in a multitude of different ways for reasons that are very complicated and mostly unknown to us. Someone said one time, when asked, well, God is perfect, so why would God do that? Why would God create this world? Why would God create this path for us to follow? Why? Perfection doesn't need a path to discover itself, right? It's perfect already. And I thought that this was just a really brilliant answer. And it said, how many of you are chocolate lovers here? My hand went up. And they said, okay, so chocolate is perfect, right? Yeah. What if that's all you ever had? What if all you ever had was chocolate? Chocolate for breakfast. Chocolate for your coffee. No coffee, just chocolate. Chocolate for your lunch. Chocolate for your brunch at the ashram. Chocolate for your dinner. Chocolate for your dessert. And only chocolate. Like nothing else with the chocolate. No fruit toppings. No, just chocolate. You'd be thrilled the first meal, right? Be like, this is heaven. And maybe the second meal. But certainly by the third meal, you'd be looking for some diversity. You'd be saying to yourself, this chocolate is great, but I want to know what else there is. And so God in its all-powerfulness is like, yeah, perfection is great, but I want to know what diversity is. And so that diversity is manifested through us for the sake of God knowing itself. Diversity is manifested through us for the sake of God knowing itself. So everything you do is God coming to know itself through you. It's interesting. When you think about that, it's like it makes being hateful or harmful a little more difficult, right? Because you're like, well, if God's coming to know itself through me, whether it's the goddess or God or, I want to be on my best behavior, right? So that comes from the attitude of God as a punisher. But God is not a punisher. So when you're not on your best behavior, God's not looking down on you and, yelling at you or punishing you. God is learning about diversity of its own self through you. But the more you commit violence and harm, the more difficult it is for you to know that, to know it, to feel it, to live it, to be it. And so here we say, there's no such thing as failure. There's only experience. There's no such thing as failure. There's only experience. And now we look at it kind of from the human place, where the human has a biological body which has great limitations to it, has a temporary life of a certain number of years, and that life has two guarantees. The one is that you're going to suffer. That's the number one guarantee, is that you're going to suffer. Necessary suffering. And the second guarantee is that you're going to suffer unnecessary suffering, because you're in a human body and you have a human mind and ego. So those are the two guarantees. You're going to suffer necessarily, and the second, you're going to suffer unnecessarily. But then there's a third guarantee. And the third guarantee or promise is this: if you surrender, if you allow, if you accept that you are a conduit for the perfection of divinity to flow through you and to bring all kinds of diversity forward, and in your free will, you make the active choice that what comes from you by way of diversity should be the diversity of goodness, the diversity of love, the diversity of unity, then your unnecessary suffering will diminish, although your necessary suffering won't. But the unnecessary suffering will. So we can take this life and we can make the active conscious choice to be in that flow with God, with Goddess. We can be that diversity coming to know its own self. And because we've been given this beautiful gift of free will, we can make this life into the optimal offering to God and to each other of goodness and love. And we can do so knowing that that will decrease the amount of unnecessary suffering for ourselves and for others, while we come into an acceptance that the necessary suffering will still happen. But then we'll have the energy to deal with it. We'll have the love to deal with it. We'll have the wherewithal to understand and to not displace our energies any longer. That makes sense? That's a lot, isn't it, on a Sunday morning? Let me read to you. So this is one of my, if I had a favorite scripture, they're all my favorites, depends on the day. But this one particularly is the Bhakti Sutras of Narada, or Narada's Bhakti Sutra. Right? So Narada was a saint, sage. And it's interesting because there are some people who say that the Narada that wrote the Bhakti Sutras, and there's more than one of these sutras that are called Bhakti Sutras, but the Narada that wrote his Bhakti Sutras was either a person who was a great guru, a great teacher, or he was a spiritual being who is mentioned in the Leelas, in the scriptures, repeatedly, but at such vast points in time that it can't be a human person. So it's got to be like this essence of personality that comes forward to present these teachings at times when they're needed for humanity to grow beyond the unnecessary suffering. And so a sutra is a very short statement, a very short thread that has an abundance of meaning to it. And these sutras are strung together so that if you read from the beginning to the end, or if you just open it up and read one verse, there'll be something there for you. Something there for you to shine a light on your inquiry and on your path. And so the second sutra here in the Narada Bhakti Sutras, it defines devotion for us. It says, the nature of spiritual devotion is supreme love. Period. The nature of spiritual devotion is supreme love. It's not money. It's not fame. It's not popularity. It's not the size of the community that comes together. It's love. And it's pure love, supreme love. And so that first statement right there tells us everything we need to know. But because we're humans with limited mindsets and with narratives, we look at it and we say, well, okay, but what about this? Is this supreme love? What about that? Is that supreme love? We try to break it down and break it away. We try to dismantle the simple statement that devotion is supreme love. We try to make exceptions. We try to say, well, this doesn't fit into that, right? So God can't be here because this person over here is just not a good person. So I don't have to love them, right? Because they're not a good person. Or that bee stung me, so I don't have to love that, right? Or this world is cruel and violent and completely unpredictable, and I don't have to love that, right? I just have to love God. But what did we just say before? We said that the inquiry is taking our narratives about any object that we have objectified and breaking it down to the essential nature of the thing, which is what? God. So you can't exclude anything. That makes our job so much harder. So much harder. Right? Because now we've got to find some way to love the one who is not a good person, or to love the bee that stung us, or to love the things that we don't want to love, because God is there. So love has to be something more than a love of something. It has to be more than an objectification. Supreme love is to simply love without objectifying anything. That's hard to say. When I was a little girl, I used to go to Catholic school. And I was always very compelled toward the Mother Mary. I always just so enamored by her and her strength and her radiance. And I would sit, when we would go into the church and the classes, we would kind of sit there and wait for them to come and do the Mass or whatever was going on. And so I would always go and sit in front of Mary. And I would just sit there and just be like so in love. And then a priest came over to me at one point and said, "You sit in front of her too often. You need to be sitting in front of Christ." So I don't want to sit there. It's not that I didn't love Christ, I do. But in that moment, I was a child feeling love for God in one of God's many forms. And I was told, no, not to. I was told there's a certain way to love, which then in my mind, I'm a child, right? So it's conditioning my mind. And the condition that it's telling me is that I need to separate. Some things are more lovable than others. Some things are more valuable than others. Some things are more God than others. And eventually that led to me not seeing the value of the bee or the value of a person who I consider to not be a good person or anything else for that fact. Because we are led to believe, led to feel, led to think we understand that God is only one thing. It is an object. But in devotion, we return to the understanding that God is everything. Everything. So there is nothing that is outside the parameters of love. Nothing. Let me read the second one to you. So it's actually the third verse. And its essence is the nectar of immortality. So devotion is supreme love, and its essence is the nectar of immortality. What does that mean? Well, we go back again to the conversation about necessary and unnecessary suffering. We understand this body is biological. It was born. It's going to be maintained for some amount of time. It's going to break down, and eventually it's going to go back to the earth. Right? So we know that this life is transient. When we are busy compartmentalizing, when we're busy valuing some things and devaluing others, we get caught up in our desires and our attachments in the world. And we begin to believe that this life is all there is, this body is all there is for me, and I better get what I can get while I'm here because I don't want to go through this life and not have gotten it all. I want it all. And so we work 60 hours a week, 80 hours a week. We get a couple of cars. We get a spouse and maybe somebody on the side. We get a couple of kids. We cheated our taxes. We see what we can get away with. We climb to the top of Mount Everest. We dive to the bottom of the ocean. We go all these different places because we got to get stuff so that this limited life finds its purpose somehow. So that I know that when I take my last breath, I have lived a full life. I've seen and done everything there is to do. Yay. But I have zero inner peace. I have zero understanding of any of those things because I was so quick to do everything that I did actually do nothing. You ever go running? I've never really been attracted to running. I mean, I've done it before. I did a couple of marathons, whatever. But I've never really been attracted to it. And I was contemplating on that. I was like, why do I not really care about that? And I thought to myself, well, I don't know. Maybe part of it is because when you're running, you don't see anything. Right? You run. You don't know what's here, and you don't know what's here because you're just running. And certainly there's an attraction to that. But for me, walking is important because then I see. I see. So it's kind of like that. We're so busy filling our life up. It's like we're running a marathon and we're filling it up with stuff that we're not seeing, that we're not really experiencing. So we become these very limited beings that are attached to transient things. It becomes a very dark existence. And then we begin our inquiry, or we deepen our inquiry. And we begin to unfold our understanding and our inherent knowing about the essence of God and God being everywhere and in all things. And pretty soon, maybe we are still running marathons, but we're not running life quite the same way. We're slowing it down and we're saying, oh, well, wait a minute. I don't need to get to the finish line over there somewhere 25 miles from here to meet God. God is right here. Whoa. God is right here. I look at you and I meet God. I meet God. I meet God. I meet God. I meet God in all of you. I look at the Murti of Krishna. I meet God. The food in the kitchen and the beautiful people who created it for you today. I meet God. The plants that became the food. You meet God. The bee that lands on your hand. You meet God. You can brush the little bee away gently. It's perfectly fine. But we go from thinking that we have to run through life to knowing that everything and every moment that we meet is a fulfillment of the greater truth of the consciousness that permeates all things everywhere, and that we are part of that consciousness. Therefore, we don't end in this life. We go beyond it. So there's no need to rush. The nectar of immortality is ours. Knowing. In India, it's very interesting. You know, take everything with a grain of salt because there's always variations, right? But generally speaking, the one thing that I noticed in India, of the many things that I noticed in India, but one of the things I noticed was that death is treated much differently there than it is here. Death is a very taboo, subject here. We don't like to talk about it. We like to talk about sex, right? Like sex is totally okay, on the table. Anybody can say whatever they want to say about it. But we don't like to talk about death. It's the opposite over there, although not really. Like they'll talk about sex, but not the same way we do. It's not considered odd to have a huge, beautiful statue of a goddess with no clothes on. It's not considered strange over there. Over here, we'd have some people in an uproar, oh my God, the female body shouldn't be seen. But they don't talk about sexuality over there. That's not an open topic. But death is a very open topic. It's an extremely open topic. And it's understood that when a person dies, there's a time for mourning. Mourning is very human. It's very healthy, and we need to do it. But there's also a celebration because this person has been freed from this life and is now going to move into the next one. And so they say, may they come back in the same or better situation than what they were in before as far as their spiritual awakening goes. May they come back as a saint. May they come back as someone who does great good in this world. May they be a unifier. May they be a compassionate soul. May they do great good in the world. May I meet them again someday. So it's a much different perspective than here in the West where we say, done, that's it. Nothing after this. Devotion leads us to knowing the vastness, to some degree, as much as we can, of God. And in that knowing, we come eventually into the understanding that we too are part of that, and therefore immortality spiritually is our birthright. Not that this body is going to live forever. No. I'm not Thor, the Hollywood Thor. Isn't he an immortal? I don't know. Does anybody here watch that? Yeah. Is Thor immortal?
I've never gathered that.
Nah. Isn't there someone on there who's an immortal? Somebody who's been like...
I think they are considered immortals.
And it's like the same body, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's always really buff too.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So you can't be an immortal unless you're buff. That's so true. Yeah. But no, our soul has spiritual buffness to it. And so it lives on and on and on and on and on and on. Let's see what the 4th verse says. So the 4th verse says, upon obtaining spiritual devotion, a person becomes a siddha. A siddha is a perfected one, beyond death and fully satisfied. And there's a lot that can be said about that. But for the sake of time, what I'm going to say is that a siddha is a person who is not bound by the gunas of nature. The gunas of nature being passion, lethargy, and stability. So a person who is not attached to any of those. A person who accepts life as it comes and still walks through with balance, with love emanating from their heart. Love of God, for God, love being in love with God and with all other beings. So the siddha is the one who is not disturbed by life's transiency and whatever experiences that brings to us. The deeper we fall into our devotion and into our love, the more perfected we become. There are other definitions of that we could go into, but for today's talk, I'm not going to. Yeah. So to walk through life, can you imagine that? Imagine right now, the thing in your life that's aggravating you the most right now, right? Could you imagine being able to be neutral to that? Being able to be neutral to whatever that problem was, not because you don't care, but because you love. And through the love, you find the solution, rather than through the animosity, through the aggravation, through the frustration. Has your frustration ever led you to a solution? Raise your hand if it has. Right. How much time do we spend frustrated? So much. But frustration doesn't lead us to a solution. It just leads us to more frustration. And then we try to impose a solution. Say, that's it. It's like with our kids, right? How many of you have kids? Your kids growing up, and for those of you who have babies now, someday you will experience this, right? Yeah. It's like we love our children unconditionally until they misbehave, and then there's lots of conditions placed on it, and we say, that's it. You will never do that again. How futile is that? That is so futile. Because, we don't have that kind of control, right? We just don't. So, life comes and it happens, and we set as healthy boundaries as we can. But we understand that life ebbs and flows, and so we meet it with love. No matter which way it's moving, we meet it with love. And perhaps through the love, we find actually a solution. Sometimes the solution is to simply accept that there are some things we can change and there are some things we can't. But then sometimes the solution has a lot to do also with putting our faith that whatever happens has purpose, even if we refuse to see it. There's purpose there for people. There's purpose for me, there's purpose for you. And on your path, you may be making choices that I don't agree with, but I don't know what purpose those situations have for you, and I can't pretend to. You will discover that because that's for you to discover. So I will love you, and I will pray and intend that what comes to you with obvious purpose, so that maybe you don't suffer unnecessarily so much. And that will give you greater strength to deal with the necessary suffering as it comes along. Make sense? Yeah. And in that way, we become more perfected. What is perfected? It's not some... that word has such trigger for us, right? Perfect, to be perfect. But we're not talking about buff, right? We're not talking about that kind of perfect. We're talking about spiritually situated in love. Spiritually situated in love. Such that the three gunas of nature impact us less and less and less. And our unity becomes more and more and more profound. This is perfect. This is perfect. Time check. Do good. And then verse 5 goes on to say, achieving spiritual devotion, one becomes completely desireless, grieving not, hating not rejoicing in fleeting happiness, without passion for personal concerns. I'm going to read that again. Achieving spiritual devotion, one becomes completely desireless, grieving not, hating not rejoicing in fleeting happiness, without passion for personal concerns. Completely desireless. This doesn't mean completely without happiness. It means without grasping. Think of the last thing you desired, like really desired. Maybe it was a chocolate bar. Maybe it was an ice cream cone. Maybe it was a pizza, right? It's like you felt this overwhelming desire. Maybe it was another person. Maybe it was, I don't know, something else. You fill in that blank. But this overwhelming desire. What happened when you got it? When you got the chocolate bar, when you got the ice cream, when you got the person, you consumed it. Right? You just consumed it. And then what did you have? I want more. I want more. Until you got sick of it. And then when you got sick of it, you were like, don't want any more of this. Desire is not happiness. Desire is grasping. Desire is a form of greed. Desire is a form of attainment. Give me what I want. Make me satisfied. But it never leaves us satisfied. We're always compelled to want more, more, more until we want different. So desire leads us on this crazy goose chase, running all over the place, looking for the thing that will fulfill us, when in fact all we have to do in order to know that thing is to turn into ourselves and to know love. But we haven't really been raised that way. We've got billboards out there that tell us get buff. We have billboards out there that tell us dye your hair. We have billboards and we have people who tell us much different things, and we've chosen to invest in that instead of the truth. So when we dive deep into devotion, then we stop with so much desire. You say, well, I understand that. If I were to eat all the chocolate in the world, other people couldn't have any. If I am attracted to somebody and I consume all their energy, I'm actually hurting them because I'm consuming all their energy. And I might also be distracting them from the things that they need to do in their life. So if you have an attraction for somebody, of course, enjoy their company and love them. But don't possess them, because that's just desire, and that's going to fade away. And it's not going to do anything but leave harm in its wake. Instead, always come back to love. Always come back to love. And let love be the devotion. Let love be the offering. And let love be the path to your own self-realization. There really is nothing else. You can read all the books you want. They'll give you a lot of good information. Right? They might give us some good stuff to talk about. But at some point we have to put the book down. And we have to be the expression of the wisdom. The embodiment of the wisdom. And the easiest way to do that is to live with devotion. I want to read one more. This next one I'm going to read because it's my favorite verse. If I had a favorite verse, this would be it. Verse number 6. And I love it in Sanskrit too. In Sanskrit it's Yat natva mato bhavati, stabto bhavati, atmaramo bhavati. Any of you know what that means? This is what it means. With a realization of spiritual devotion, one becomes spiritually intoxicated, one becomes overwhelmed, and one comes to rejoice in the self. Not overwhelmed like stressed out, but full of love, like the light bulb that cannot contain its light. It has to shine its light out for everyone else to see. Become spiritually intoxicated. Not that you're like walking around like you're drunk all the time, but that you just understand. There's a knowing. And that knowing softens every sharp edge of life. It softens everything, and you become softer. And because you're softer, you get to see more of the brilliance. And seeing the brilliance makes you giddy a little bit sometimes. Childlike sometimes. Very straightforward sometimes. But always soft. And the intoxication is one that, again, is like the light bulb that can't contain its own light. It is inspiration for all those around you. You don't have to go up to people and say, hey, you should really do this if you want to be happy. You don't have to do that. People will seek you. They'll seek it out. They'll say, why are you so happy? Don't you get stressed? It's like, well, of course, but it does deal with it differently, you know? You become an inspiration, and in that way, you teach people. In that way, you teach yourself continually. You reinforce yourself continually the importance of devotion. How do you be devoted? What do you do to be devoted? Do you have to have an altar? Do you have to have an object on the altar? Well, it's up to you. People have different temperaments. Some people like to have that physical presence in front of them as a reminder, because so much of what we think we understand comes in through the senses, what we see, what we hear, what we smell, taste, and touch. So we see Krishna, we hear the mantra, we taste the food, the prasad. So it's helpful to have that, for sure, because we're sensory beings. But do you have to have that? No, of course not. But if you're not looking at an image of God, what are you looking at? Right? Are you strong enough to be able to look at anything and see God? Or are your eyes undisciplined and they look to what's sexy? They look to what's violent. And the ego says, oh, it's all God. And it's like, yeah, but it's racking your nervous system and making you a mess, right? So therefore you don't think that's God. It's just stimulus. So have a picture, your chosen avatar, whatever it happens to be, have all of them, right? I love when I go into a yogi's house and they have a wall of pictures. And it's like every living saint there ever was and every teacher that ever touched them. And there's like picture after picture after picture. And, Shiva and Durga and Kali and Christ and Buddha and Muhammad. And they're all up there. And you're like, oh, yeah, exactly. The more you look at that, the more you'll understand. It's called tratak. You look at the thing and you acquire the qualities of the thing. You look at God's image, and whatever image you choose of God, you acquire the qualities of that. You look at the sexy advertisements or the violent movies, you'll acquire the qualities of that. Devotion is more easily expressed when you are concentrating on the qualities of divinity versus the qualities of the human ego. I'll stop there and say, are there any questions or comments today? Yes?
I had a question, kind of the devil's advocate position on you were talking about everything being an expression of the flow of consciousness. I tend to see it that way too, but I was wondering what your response would be to the sort of materialist who would say that consciousness is no more than an emergent property of neurological processes.
Sure. I'd say sure.
You'd say sure?
Yeah.
It doesn't conflict, is that what you're saying?
It doesn't conflict. Because then you have to add, you need to, you could go back to the inquiry, right? And I may or may not discuss this with them. It all depends on the conversation. But say, yeah, but why do those synapses happen?
Right.
Like, why? So certainly consciousness is coming forward because of those interactions, but why are those interactions happening? What's your explanation? When you say, what is that dependent upon for its own being, for its own existence, the scientist might say, well, we don't understand that yet. It's something in the quantum field. Okay, great. I accept that 100%. What's the quantum field reliant upon? You just keep going until you get to the point where you can go no more. And not that you can't go anymore because we don't have a rational human explanation for it, but because there's nothing beyond that. Right? There's nothing beyond that. And what there is nothing beyond consciousness. And how do we acknowledge that is to say, well, something intelligent brought forth the quantum field. And something intelligent brought forth some aspect of the functionality of the brain, although we can also say that was a consequence of the bringing forth of the quantum field, right? This is going to be a little heady for a moment, but we can say that consciousness brought forth one thing, and as a consequence of bringing that one thing forth, everything else emerged, right? So therefore, everything else folds back into that one thing, which folds back into consciousness, or to sunyata, or to Shiva, or whatever name it is that one wants to give to that. Yeah. And I know there's like lots of back and forth that can be said to there, but it really does come down to that one question. What does that rely on?
Sure. It trickles all the way down.
Yeah, exactly. Any other questions or reflections? Thank you for that. That was a great question. Yes?
I've just heard it expressed as like being in the mind of God. I mean, so I don't know if you think of it like that, or
Yeah.
I don't know. It's very boggling,
Yeah. To be in the mind of God.
Are we all part of the mind of God?
I would say we are expressions. We are God's mind thinking. We are God's mind expressing. We are God's synapses. Yes. Being in the mind of God objectifies the mind of God as something other than what we are, and we're kind of an invader in there. But no, we are the mind of God. We are the heart of God. We are the flow of God. Does God have a mind? Does God have a heart? Not the way that we see it. But since we're going to anthropomorphize everything, because that's what we do, right? Anthropomorphize means to make the thing human. We can say if God had a mind, we would be the mind of God. We would be the thoughts that the mind is producing. If God had a heart, we would be the heart of God. We would be the emotions, the expression of love, the potential, right? We are the potential of God, manifesting over and over and over again all of the subtleties of diversity. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a fun kind of for me, and I don't know, I can get really kind of taken away with thinking about that. To me, that's so beautiful. It's like, it's not and people try to explain it like a symbiont relationship, but it's not really, because we're not really other than, we're not other than. We're here because that is here too. If that wasn't here, we couldn't be here, because we are an expression of that. I'll stop there. Anybody else? Yes.
So in class when we were studying the gunas, right, and I loved the idea of like comic book personifications of those qualities. But I still find that even after all the scriptures and the studying, like I still have a really hard time like figuring out the balance, or maybe it is just that constant dance of those things in the devotion. I don't know, can you just speak to the gunas?
Sure, yeah. So the gunas, again, the three qualities that are always present in nature, and the three qualities that are always present in us, because our physical manifestation is part of nature. We are part of nature. So the three are passion, lethargy, and purity or balance. In our human experience, because of the unnecessary suffering versus the necessary suffering, we say to ourselves, one is exciting, one is boring, and one is kind of neutral. We know that there's a health consequence to that which is exciting. Exciting is fun. It's stimulating. It's exciting. It's addictive. It's something that we strive for. But we know that if we only strive for that, then we will probably end up sick, tired, burnt out, right? We also know that the lethargy has health consequences for us. And this is just one example. I can give you 10,000 different examples. But the lethargy has health consequences for us. It's boring. It's dull. It's stuck. It's not a lot of mobility. It's addictive. It's depressing. It's addictive. And so if we go to that place in our life in any way, shape, or form, we're going to have health consequences associated with that. So the neutral really seems to be the healthiest place to be. And initially we have to strive for that. We have to be like, okay, I'm going to go on a diet. Okay, I'm going to train for the marathon. Okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to count my steps, 10,000 steps a day. Okay, I'm not going to eat fried food. Initially, we really strive for that. And in that striving, there's still a longing for the excitement and the depression. It's like, today I really want hyperstimulation. Today I really don't want to do anything. We go back and forth, and we try to negate the impact of these two for the sake of the middle. That won't work for very long. That battle between those three armies will be continual, particularly the two. But sometimes, in certain parts of our life, what'll happen is that by working toward a more balanced experience, we discover within ourselves some aspect of the truth of peace and the truth of goodness, the truth of health, the truth of love. And it compels us to continue on. It compels us, and we say, so a personal example, I used to love Stephen King movies. I was a real horror movie buff in my youth. Loved it. Absolutely loved it. Slasher films in the 80s, 100%, right? Yeah. I can't do them anymore. I don't want to, because I know what they do to my nervous system. I don't have a longing anymore. Like in my 20s, I would still be like, oh, there's a new Stephen King movie coming out. Yeah, and I would go and I would sit there and be like, oh, this is so bad, 30s, every once in a while, I'd be like, oh, there's a new Stephen King film coming out. I used to love his movies so much. I really want to go see this one. Maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. Maybe I will. Okay, I will. Sit there the whole time, I have nightmares for 4 nights after. In my 40s, I'm like, oh, Stephen King's got a new film coming out. That's nice. Don't need to go see it, And now in my 50s, it's like, oh, not even. And not because I think they're bad movies or anything, but just because I know, and so the desire is not there anymore. The attachment to the desire is not there. The attachment to the depression is not there. So I can exist in the place of that sameness. I can exist in the place of that sameness without the effort. Which means I've actually moved beyond that place of sameness. At least in regard to horror movies, right? Because eventually that's what we want to do. Eventually we want to be neutral to all three. It's like just do good and be good, and the rest takes care of itself. In all your actions, do good, be good. Don't upset your nervous system. Don't upset your digestive system. It's going to get upset on its own sometimes from time to time. So don't you do it. This way, when it does happen, you'll have more energy to recover and recuperate. Right? Yeah. Is that helpful? Okay, good. All right, we're going to stop there because I think that was them saying lunch is ready for y'all. So let's sit tall. We'll close the eyes. Draw the hands together in front of the heart. And together we'll lift our voices in one Om. Take a breath in. And releasing the hands down. And so just a quick couple of announcements. We have a new schedule in place for January moving forward, so please go online and check that out. Just a couple of time changes, not for Sundays, other than the brunch will start earlier. And also, we are unveiling our 6-year spiritual study program. So this is an in-depth spiritual study that goes into a variety of scriptures. There's 20 of them actually from the tradition. And right now we're doing the Tattva Bodha. You can still come into that as drop-ins if you want to. It's every Monday night from 7 to 8, 7 to 8:15 on Zoom initially, but we're going to be moving to also in person. So if you want to come Monday nights, you can do that. Just know that there'll also be a Zoom set up for people who are online. And it's a 6-year study, so it's 20 levels of study, and it's just a really nice way to continue to go deeper and deeper and deeper. You can drop into those as well, but to really do it continuously, it has the greatest benefit to it. So you can get more information about that online. I think Casey's making the announcement for that today if she hasn't done it already. And have a great day. Enjoy your lunch. Namaste, everybody.
Yeah. Come on,